Could you state your name, please?
My name is Barry Feiden.
And could you spell your...
The Army considers my name to be Arthur Barry Feiden.
Could you spell your last name for the record?
F as in Frank, E-I, D as in David, E-N.
And your age?
88.
And your date of birth?
July 5th, 1924.
And your rank in the Army?
I was a full-fledged corporal.
And your unit?
The 104th Infantry Division.
And your approximate time of service, from what years to what year did you serve?
Oh dear. 1943 to 45.
Okay. And today's date?
Today is November 14th.
15th, actually.
1920.
1912. Why does
2012.
2012? Why does the Army consider your name to be Arthur?
Because that was the name on my birth certificate. However, my folks never called me Arthur, and I was always known as Barry, but the Army insists that my name was Arthur.
And that was your introduction to Army life.
That's it.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was at home in Newburgh, New York, in the living room with an old-fashioned radio. The whole family was tuned in to all the details that we could gather from Pearl Harbor.
And you remember your reaction, or your parents' reaction, or the result?
Well, I remember at the time an uncle of ours was visiting us, and I remember his comments being, "My God, we've got problems with natural resources. We've got to protect." He was a chemist, and he was concerned with the shortage of materials that might occur as a result.
Tell me about a little bit about your family background? What did your father do in Newburgh?
My father was a merchant. He left home when he was 13. He never went to school, but he was an intellectual and self-taught, but he knew that he should learn Latin, and he would study Latin, even though it had no application in his life. My mother came from a family much better off, but they lived in Newburgh. My father initially left home at about age 13. He went to New York, and he worked there. He hated New York City, and he always looked at trains that went out as an ideal trip that he should take. And eventually they moved out of New York.
So you were born in Newburgh.
I was born in New York, but we lived in Newburgh. My mother went to New York to give birth where her family lived, and then I went directly back to Newburgh.
Were you very, as a teenager, were you very aware of the political situation? Were you watching what was going on in Europe before Pearl Harbor?
In Newburgh, there was the Newburgh News had a front window. In the window, they posted the latest news. So every day during that period, I would go to the Newburgh News to read the current news of the world. So yes, our family was very much aware of what was going on.
So, but nonetheless, you were shocked when the Japanese attack.
Well, we were all shocked. The fact that we were watching a war in Europe in detail and the invasion of foreign countries by Germany didn't mean we were aware of what was going on with Japan. So, yes, we were shocked. Or I was shocked.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how did life change after Pearl Harbor for you? You were 16 or 17 years old.
Well, I was still going to high school and continued, and I went to college for a year, and then enrolled in the Army while I was at college.
What college?
Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I was studying engineering, and there was a program, ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, that indicated that they would continue my engineering training because the country would be needing engineers during the war. So after a few months and after enrolling, they called us up for active duty and sent us to basic training.
Tell me, where did you go for basic training?
Well, initially I went to Camp Fannin in Texas, and after, I guess, a 13-week basic training program, assigned to St. Bonaventure College to continue engineering training. And that went on for about 6 months, I don't know exactly, at which point they decided it was much more important to have infantrymen than to have engineers. So off I went to infantry training.
Was it tough? Was it a tough transition getting adjusted to Army life?
Not really. I was young, very flexible. It was just another change. I didn't have great trouble. I didn't enjoy the military. I thought it was enough of a waste of time. But I didn't had great problems in the transition.
That was your first time away from the New York area, though, too, right?
Well, I had been at college.
Okay.
Away from the New York area, yes, but not away from home.
Gotcha. So all of a sudden they plunked you into the infantry.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that?
Well, I wasn't happy about it, but there wasn't much I could do about it. It was a war, as my wife described to you earlier. We all felt very strongly about it, and that was what the country needed, and that was all I could do.
And of course, all your friends, I imagine, were in the service too.
Most of them, yeah.
So what came next? You were assigned to the infantry, and you went through.
Well, after I went to basic training in Camp Carson, Colorado, and after, I don't know, a few months there, that was, I guess I was there during the invasion of France in June of that year. And we were told we were going to go overseas immediately afterwards, and they sent us to, I think it was Fort Dix, someplace in New Jersey, prior to going overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And the night before we were to get aboard a ship, there was a fire set up, and everyone was throwing their unused belongings that they weren't going to take with them
Mm-hmm.
into the fireplace.
This was at Fort Dix?
Yeah. And someone threw presumably by accident, threw a live bullet in the fire. And it exploded and hit a very close friend of mine in the eye. And he lost his eye. I lost contact with him until a couple of months ago when he called me up. And we exchanged a lifetime of experiences together.
But that was the end of his war.
But that was the end of his war, yeah.
So they put you on board a ship and you shipped out of New York Harbor?
Yeah. Yes. We joined a convoy, a huge convoy that went overseas. There was no submarine activity that I was aware of. We were the first unit to land directly in France after the invasion of the continent.
Mm-hmm.
So we landed in Omaha Beach, but it was secured at the time.
So when did you actually land in France?
Well, I think in September of, what was the year?
Well, 44.
Yeah, so it would be September 44.
And you landed directly on the beach
Yeah.
from New York. Just went.
Yeah.
What was the scene that greeted you there at Omaha Beach? What did Omaha Beach look like at this point, 3 months after the invasion?
It was still filled with debris, military debris that from the invasion. It was an incredible scene to believe that they took that beachhead. It was a solid, high cliff that they had to traverse to get inland. I don't know how how it could have been successful, but it was at an awful cost.
There's still a lot of the material all over the beach, and
Yeah, the beach was still filled with military hardware that had been presumably broken and unusable.
Mm-hmm. So where did you go from there?
Well, we stayed in Normandy for maybe a week or so. I don't know the time period. And then we went to Holland. And that's where we dug our first holes.
Mm-hmm.
But we really didn't see any combat in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, we moved east towards Germany.
Where did you first see combat? Tell me about the first time you saw combat. There's the Rhine River, and parallel to that river,
I don't know the distance. I think it was the Ruhr River. We crossed the Ruhr, and between the Ruhr and the Rhine, we saw a lot of combat.
Can you tell me about that?
Not much.
Mm-hmm.
We were shooting one another. It wasn't very nice. There were a lot of dead people around.
This would have been when? October of 1944? November?
It was... This is strictly a guess. I would guess it was about November.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were there during the Battle of the Bulge. We were in the southern part of the battle line, but
Mhm.
we were not in the battle itself. They spread our division out, and we covered a larger area, but we're not in the fight itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then, once that was over, south of us, the Remagen Bridge was captured,
Mm-hmm.
intact.
And that was the bridge over the Rhine, correct?
Yeah. I'm possibly confused here, because I know we entered Cologne at some stage,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess we must have been in Cologne before we went south.
Mm-hmm.
And we went in across the Remagen Bridge at a day or two after it was captured. The Army engineers had already put a pontoon bridge across the Rhine, so we crossed that bridge, not the existing Remagen Bridge. And from that point on, the German army was in complete disarray.
Mm-hmm.
When we got across the Remagen Bridge head, all we saw were stragglers wandering, and they looked very old and ragged,
Mm-hmm.
and at a loss to what was going on.
Mm-hmm. How about do you recall when where did you first cross into Germany? Was that at Remagen?
No, it was west of Cologne.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Ruhr River that I described.
Okay, that would have been where you first.
Was in German property.
How did the German civilians respond to you? Do you recall when meeting any German civilians?
Well, not at that point. Later on, after we got into Remagen, and towards the end of the war, and that was really the end of the war, we met up with German civilians. And at one point, we lived in a house, and I think the town was Bitterfeld. In a house where there were German people. They were all anti-Hitler. No one was in favor of Hitler. Not far from that town, our unit came across a concentration camp. It was an absolute horror.
Which camp was it? That was Camp Dora, I think you said, right?
Dora Miradorf, I'm not sure exactly.
Mhm.
It was piled with bodies.
Was this the camp where they'd been building the rockets? Or is that...
I learned that later on. I can't verify that, but they were, I understand they used the people at the camp as labor for the...
To build the V2s and...
Your question, going back to your question, did we have contact with German citizens? We were directed to assemble a group of people and take them through this concentration camp. And the reaction of those people was absolute denial that this could have happened, that they knew, no one knew anything about this. I have always prided myself of a lack of prejudice of any group of or type of people in the world, but unfortunately, that doesn't apply to me as a regard to the Germans. I have an absolute distaste for everything it represented by the Teutonic approach to life.
To this day.
To this day. We've done a lot of traveling, but I would never go back to Germany.
Tell me a little bit more about your coming up to that camp, though. I want to find out a little bit more about that. I mean, because
Coming up to
the camp, about your discovery, because of course now, 70 years after the war, we've known about Hitler's crimes and the concentration camps and the death camps and the final solution. That's been known for many years now. But in 1944, 1945, nobody knew about these things. And I'd like to find out about hear about the actual discovery, what it was like.
Well, first of all, our media group didn't discover it.
Okay.
It was our division,
Okay.
other parts of it that discovered it. We went to it. It was an absolute shock to see what can be done to human bodies. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I understand this is difficult, even 70 years after the fact.
Anyway, let's get on.
Okay. So what happened? How long did you stay there for?
Probably just a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
Long enough to know that help was help was on the way.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors came pouring in
Mm-hmm.
and help. Food was arrived.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea how long we stayed.
Mm-hmm. But that wasn't the end of your war, though. You continued. That was.
Yeah, somewhere, it was during this time also, we ran into the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians came bearing lots of vodka.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I had ever had a drink before. But after my contact with the Russians, that night, I got to bed and was so sick and so unprepared. That was the last time I actually got drunk.
First and last.
I was such a mess when I woke up after that night.
Tell me about the Russian troops. What were they like?
They were friendly. We exchanged little gadgets with one another. They were proud of their achievement. We found them delightful. And, you know, it was only an evening or two that we had any contact with them. But I think I still have a couple of little pins that they gave me.
Mm-hmm.
There's one other aspect of my war experience that you should know about.
What's that?
I guess a day or two after the liberation of Paris, we drove through Paris. And in the truck, it was a covered truck so that you couldn't look out because of the canvas, because they said they didn't want the Germans to know whether we were moving troops or not. So I drove through Paris, and all I could see is a little slit of light of Paris, my first visit to Paris. That was a great disappointment.
They probably didn't want you jumping out.
Yeah.
So tell me, continue after the Russians. What happened after you met up with the Russian forces? The war was almost over, but
Yeah.
were you in combat right up to VE Day, or
No, I'm not sure when it stopped, but when we got to where the concentration camp was, we stopped. We were no longer in combat at
Mhm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, we were told the war was over, and there was a point system to get out,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have enough points to get out. But instead of having the pleasure of staying and exploring Europe a bit, they sent me home right away with orders to go back to assemble in California to be shipped out to Japan.
You thought you were going to be part of the invasion of Japan.
Yeah. And that was a scary thing. I kind of felt, well, you can survive one war, but it's not likely you're going to survive two of them. So I was home when actually on leave when the bomb was dropped.
The bomb on Hiroshima.
Yeah. And subsequently, I went to New York on D-Day, on E.J. Day.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more before we get to that. Tell me about when you heard about the atomic bomb. You heard about the bombing of Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Tell me about that, because nobody knew about the atomic bomb. You recall anything about your reaction, or?
Yeah. I was absolutely delighted. I had no reservations then. I had no reservations on the second bomb, and I have no reservations now. And I know many people have second-guessed Truman on that. I think he did the right thing.
Because it meant you were going to live.
That's right.
So tell me about New York and VJ Day.
It was a mob scene. I enjoyed it, but I don't even know who I went with or how I got down there, but all I know is I was there when the announcement came.
And was it just, the city was just one big party, or?
It was one big party. It was a long war, and ours was the shortest part of it.
Mm-hmm.
When you think in terms of what the European nations went through, and the suffering caused by the Germans. So yeah, it was a big party.
When did you finally get out of the service? When were you demobilized?
Well, I still had orders to appear in California, and then we had all our friends writing letters to keep us from going over to Japan, and eventually they changed our orders. But I still didn't have enough points, so somehow or other I ended up in Seattle. And assigned to a train detail that took veterans from Japan back east or back home. So my job, they trained me to be a cook. However, it was a time when the Army was a little lax in discipline, and it was easy to avoid some kind of details. So I sort of avoided classes for a while until I heard that they were picking crews to go to New York to bring the veterans home. So I was able to get on a train, and all I can remember is serving apples to the veterans on the train trip from Washington to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I took, I think, 2 or 3 of those trips.
You cooked,
and had enough points to get out.
Did you cook a mean apple?
I didn't do very much. I didn't serve the country well in that job.
Mm-hmm. So you were demobilized in New York. You were cashiered out.
No, I was demobilized in Washington.
Mm-hmm. You were anxious to get out of the Army at that point?
Yeah, I sure was. I sure was. And got out of the Army, went back to school.
Where'd you go to school? Where did you end up?
Well, somewhere while I was in service, I read about a new school being set up at Cornell, a School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And I decided I wanted to go to it rather than to continue in engineering. So I applied to Cornell, and they accepted me, but said since I can return to RPI, they accepted me a year later. So I went back to RPI then, prior to transferring to Cornell.
Did you get the GI Bill benefits?
Oh, I got the GI Bill benefits. They were wonderful. They really trained a whole generation of people, and I think it It was a great program. And our generation got out of college without being in debt because of it. And it's probably the best investment the government can make is in the education of its young people.
Well, it probably resulted in a generation of prosperity, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
How do you think your time in the Army changed you?
Well, the one thing that it taught me was that how to enjoy living out of doors. I love camping as a result of being in the Army. And
You may be one of the few people ever to claim that.
well, when we were in Europe, as the winter season was setting in, we got an order from the high command that we can move into houses. These are German houses we're talking about. And I felt very uncomfortable not living outside and moving from camping out to living in a house again. You get acclimated to almost any change. So that's one way it changed me.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the war changed the country?
Well, the economic, we had come out of a deep depression. We hadn't soared out of it, so the country was not at its economic top level. During the war, that changed everything. Jobs were available, people had work, the country thrived, even though we were building war material that were not for civilian use. And the country was unified. Prior to the war, World War II, there was a lot of people supporting isolationism. There was a lot of people who felt, as is the case today, the government was too big and is doing things that it has no business doing. That all changed. And I think it changed for the better. Unfortunately, we've lost that feeling of cooperation that existed during that period.
So you really felt you're part of some sort of greater.
Yeah.
The war was 75 years ago now at this point, almost, or 65 years ago, I guess, was the end of the war. And you saw some of the most horrible aspects of it in fighting through Germany, and of course the camps. Do you still think of those things? Do you ever? I mean,
Well, I guess when I talk about the concentration camp, I do, but other than that,
mm-hmm.
no. What's past is past.
Mm-hmm.
You can't relive anything.
Mm-hmm. Did most of your friends come through the war okay?
A high percentage of them did.
Mm-hmm.
But there are two brothers that I knew from Newburgh, both of whom lost their lives in the war. But generally speaking, most people
Mm-hmm.
did come through.
You look like you're about to say something. Any last thoughts you'd like to share? I mean, any other ideas?
No. I guess really you asked your last person you interviewed who her favorite president was, and she said FDR. I was thinking that maybe there's someone else, and that would be Jefferson, who was responsible for the checks and balance system that makes this country survive such vicious attacks from selfish people in our society.
Do you think Roosevelt would be a close second?
Yeah. Yes.
One last question. What was it like hearing? Well, you were in the service and you were in Europe when the news came that FDR died in April of '45. Can you tell me a little bit about your reaction? I mean, once again, if he's the only president you'd known for 12 years, I can't imagine that.
Oh, it was very sad. I mean, this is a guy who led us and we trusted. Yeah, it was a sad moment. It was a sad period, particularly since we knew nothing about Truman, or I knew nothing about Truman, who I came to respect greatly. But yes, it was sad also that he didn't have the chance to taste final victory.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time today.